Good evening, everyone. My name is Noveline S. Solaris, and my report is all about psychopathology, assessment, and psychotherapy. This framework emphasizes a response process that include both self-expressive and organizational components. That is, what the respondent says and how he or she structures the response. It is clear that projective tests have value in the assessment process, and we will try to address their value within a broad overview, incorporating projective tests and methods within a single domain. Problems with definitions and distinctions. Anastasia and Urbina have characterized a projective test as a relatively unstructured task. That is, a task that permits almost an unlimited variety of possible responses. In order to allow free play to individuals' fantasy, only brief, general instructions are provided. Now, some psychologists treat the characteristic of each class of instrument as mutually exclusive or as polar opposites. For example, because objective tests are thought of as unbiased measures, projective tests by default are assumed to be subjective. And because objective tests are seen as having standardized administration and scoring, projective tests are assumed to lack of empirical rigor. Now, there are a number of reasons that the projective objective dichotomy leads to an oversimplified and biased understanding of projective tests. First one is the projective objective dichotomy often results in misleading reductionism. Instruments under the rubric of projective are assumed to be uniform in content, purpose, and methodology. For example, all projective instruments are often reduced and treated as equivalent to classic exemplar such as the Rorschach. Reducing all projective instruments to the Rorschach ignores their incredible diversity. And the second one is projective objective dichotomy implies that there are characteristics unique to each class of test, but these supposed hallmarks are misleading. For example, test elements identified as projective, such as the flexible response format and ambiguous or incomplete stimuli, are employed by tests generally considered to be models of objectivity and quantification. For an example, one of the items of MMPI is once in a while, I laugh at a dirty joke. It contains ambiguities. At the most basic level, it is unclear whether once in a while refers to once a day, once a week, or once in a month. And the third one, the stereotypic juxtaposition of objective and projective testing lends a pejorative connotation to projective tests that suggest they lack objectivity. Many of projective tests are quantified and standardized in terms of administration. If we take the example of cognitive tests, the style or process of the response can be systematically observed, quantified, and standardized. This qualitative to quantitative test development strategy is exactly the same procedure used in sophisticated quantification of projective tests, as in the Rorschach Comprehensive System and the Washington Sentence Completion Test. Of course, quantification and reducing examiner bias, that is, variability introduced by examiners, are important goals in improving psychological assessment. And finally, projective and objective tests resemble each other in that they share the same goal, the description of personality, psychopathology, and problems in living. However, dichotomy highlights the differences in method, and overlooks fundamental differences in their approach to understanding personality. Problems with common metaphors and models. Now, like the distinction between projective and objective tests, the common metaphors and models used to describe the projective response process can be grossly misleading. The two well known metaphors of the projective response process are blank screen and the X ray machine. First, we will discuss the blank screen metaphor. Blank screen metaphor is a projective test stimulus portrayed as a blank screen or canvas upon which the respondent projects his or her inner world. When taken to the extreme, the blank screen metaphor has had two consequences on our approach to projective tests. First is an overemphasis on response content, and second is an underappreciation for the role of the projective test stimulus and the examination content or examination content. By examination context, we mean the various situational factors as experienced by the respondent. These include the demands of the respondent given the circumstances of the evaluation, the implicit and explicit consequences of the examination, and the interaction between the examiner and the respondent. The blank screen metaphor suggests that the only necessary component to um, um, projective stimuli are ambiguity and a lack of structure. Now, these components are thought to facilitate respondents or to facilitate response content. That is, the free expression of the respondent's internal world. The more ambiguous and unstructured the stimulus, the more it was presumed that the personality would be directly expressed in response. What we know about Herman Rorschach's work in developing his test attests to the fact that it is not ambiguity or lack of structure that contributes to the test usefulness. It appears that each stimulus plate was designed to contain visually recognizable forms or critical bits, along with some arbitrary components. Thus, it seems that the stimulus plates were intended to be provocative to respondents while also being just unclear enough to engage respondents' problem solving skills. This inconsistency between the recognizable or suggestive components of the stimulus plates and the more arbitrary forms are critical because it constitutes a problem to be solved. In this sense, projective test stimuli have a clear purpose. That is to present the respondent with a problem solving task. Next one is the X ray metaphor. In this metaphor, a projective test acts as an X ray of the mind, so to speak, that allows the interpreter to observe directly the contents of the respondent's mind. However, like the blank screen metaphor, the X ray metaphor leads to a focus on response content and or the response content and the way in which the content directly represents personality. More importantly, the X ray metaphor diminishes the role of the respondent in the response process. Frank, who first used the X ray metaphor, contended that personality is an active process. In Frank's view, the world of culture also influences the personality and its understanding of the external world, but cannot account for personality processes and behavior. Moreover, unlike self report tests, projective test stimuli give respondents an opportunity to express their organizational styles and affect. Thus, A projective test allows the examiner to observe personality in action with cognitive, affective, interpersonal, and meaning making activities. The behavioral response process model. A problem solving model leads us to approach personality as a processor of information rather than interpreting a response as a symbolic representation of personality. We interpret it in the context of the stimulus situation and use that interpretation to build a model of respondents processing and the problem solving styles. And rather than using a static conceptualization of personality, our understanding incorporates a model of personality as a problem solving processor of life's ongoing challenges. The projective test response can be seen as the development and formulation of a solution to a problem, the structure and content of which reveals something about the individual. Every projective test involves a task, which we can understand as a problem to be solved. The standards for educational psychological tests. It incorporates the interest in the response process. According to the standards, evidence based on examination of the response process, including eye movements and the self descriptions of the respondent's experience, should be used to validate tests' inferences. Each projective test differs in its response process so that each test must be addressed and mastered separately, even if these tests share some common processes and principles. Self expressive and organizational components. Within the response process in projective testing, two components have traditionally been identified. First is a content or self expressive component, which we're going to discuss now, and second is a formal or organizational component. Often, these components are referred to as the projective and problem solving components of projective tests, but these terms are subject to misinterpretation. To oversimplify, the self expressive component largely involves content features of the response. That is, what the subject says, writes, or draws, and what associations the individual brings to the task. Self expression occurs because projective stimuli provoke the imagination, acting as a stimulus to fantasy. Thus, respondents react to content suggestions in a task, such as a sentence stem, a picture, or a recognizable form or a critical bit of a Rorschach plate, and rely on themselves to go beyond that content to access and express information from their own stores of images, experiences, feelings, and thoughts. Now, in contrast, organizational component involves the formal or structural features of the response, how the individuals answers the questions, solve the task, structures the response, and makes decisions. Use of detail and the accuracy of the response are organizational features which can be applied to almost all projective tests. Projective tests all pose problems to solve. The adequacy, style, and the structure of the solutions to the problems are encompassed by the organizational component. The projective test stimulus situation. The projective testing stimulus encompasses a complex of factors. The stimulus in a projective test is more than the concrete stimulus itself. That is, more than merely a picture, a sentence stem, a Rorschach plate, or an invitation to remember. The actual stimulus of the projective test is the entire situation, or what we call stimulus situation. The stimulus situation encompasses the interpersonal interaction with the examiner, what the respondent is asked to do with the stimulus, and the contextual issues such as the reason for referral. Now, processing the stimulus situation, respondent reacts to an overall situation, including both concrete and experiential components as a pattern or field. And such patterning is a well known fact in the study of human perception. The respondents organizes that field into figuring ground, responding more distinctly to the figural components of the stimulus situation. This figure ground patterning exists not only within the processing of the concrete projective test stimulus, but also with the entire stimulus situation. Now we have three formats in the free response. First is the freedom the stimulus situation, second is the response characteristics, and the third one is the interpretive implications. First one is the freedom in the stimulus situation. Freedom and lack of direction are crucial characteristics of the projective test stimulus situation. The individual can choose to attend to different components of the stimulus or stimulus situation, focusing on, for example, a particular element of the physical stimulus, a demand within the task, or some interpersonal aspect related to the task. Now, response characteristics with self report test, the interpretive dimensions are predetermined. The interpreter observes the respondent's behavioral patterns in order to construct the dimensions to be described. Projective tests are typically open ended, free, unstructured, and have the virtue of allowing the respondent to project his own organizational or organization on the material. Compared to self report tests, the fixed test stimuli in self report tests and limited response options or options themselves account for a much greater part of the variation among test responses or behaviors. Lastly, interpretive implications, or what has been called expressive style, is an example of the organizational component of a projective test response. The free response component of the projective test stimulus situation allows expressive style to emerge. Expressive style is also captured in nonverbal ways, which are important to understanding an individual's functioning and interpersonal relationships. Projective tests allow one to observe the interaction between the self expressive and instrumental components of behavior. In other words, how adequate a response is in light of how one solves a problem. Extending in this interaction, projective test behavior also allows the examiner to observe the impact of emotional and interpersonal pressures of on the adequacy and approach to solving problems. This is crucial contribution of projective tests to assessment, providing an interpretive link between findings from self-report tests and ability tests. A behavioral approach to validity. Behavioral characteristics is a problem solving in projective testing entails a behavioral view of the response process. Psychological tests are undertaken when we cannot directly access behaviors important to assessment goals. In performance tests, we induce and observe a sample of behavior that is similar to the behavior of interest in real life. In this respect, projective tests are performance tests. Generalizability and interpretation. In interpreting projective tests, we observe test behavior and then generalize it to similar behavior in other situations. When considering a projective test as a behavioral problem solving task, the question of validity is one of topographic similarity and functional equivalency. Now, topographic similarity refers to the degree to which the test behavior resembles the non test behavior in concrete, physical, and descriptive terms. To understand the topographical similarity within projective tests, one must examine the behavior induced by projective test demands. Functional equivalence, moreover, refers to a degree to which the antecedents and consequences of a test behavior correspond to the antecedent and consequences of real life behavior. Projective tests incorporate complex stimulus situations and induce rich and complex behaviors that vary greatly from person to person. Projective tests collect standardized samples of real life behavior, the problem solving of the personality operations in real life. Experiential interpretation. These include or experiential elements. These include subjective and covert problem solving elements such as self expressive and interpersonal phenomena associated with the response process. For the Rorschach, it would mean asking what processes are involved in avoiding the complexity and contradictions of a blot so as to give simplistic, uninvolved answers. For the figure drawing, experience near approach would take into consideration not only the product such as the drawing, but also the process of creating it. Experiential interpretation of a figure drawing might also require such questions as what experiences or covert processes might accompany drawing this frightening person? What would it be like to meet or have a conversation with this frightening person? Now, answers to these questions are more likely to have non test reference than are the non experiential. Detail oriented questions that have dominated some approaches to drawing, such as how long are the arms, how the hands represented, did the respondent mention the head, was shading involved? Examining the three dimensional vista, response on the Rorschach might elucidate the experiential and contextual components of interpretation. Now, these three dimensional shading responses might mean very different things in different contexts. From an experiential problem solving perspective, the VISTA response involves a more precise way of dealing with the blots, in which one experiences the self as stepping back and evaluating. Functional equivalence and generalization. This interaction among interpretation, examination context, and topographical and experiential phenomena relates to functional equivalence and generalization. Functional equivalence refers to the degree to which the antecedents and consequences of a test behavior correspond to the antecedents and consequences of real life behavior. The antecedents and consequences of test behaviors are encompassed by the projective stimulus situation. Projective stimulus situations or test environments vary to some extent from test to test and occasion to occasion. Functional equivalence helps us to interpret the contradictory information so often produced during assessment. Thus, the stimulus situation and functional equivalency guide the generalization and interpretation of projective test behaviors along a situation specific or versus pervasive dimension. As, as interpretation becomes more specific, it should be confined to situations that more closely resemble the projective test stimulus situation. And that's all for my report. Thank you for listening.